The snow had just begun to fall when the stranger rode into the valley. His horse moved slow, its breath rising in pale clouds against the cold dusk. Across the frozen creek, smoke curled from a lonely cabin half buried in the white silence. He pulled on the reins, studying it the way a man studies a distant memory, half wanting to approach, half fearing what waits inside. The air smelled of pine and frost, and the faint glow from the cabin window looked almost like hope in a world that had long forgotten warmth. Inside that cabin, a widow sat beside the fire, her hands folded around a tin cup of weak coffee. She hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, not since the last snowstorm had cut her off from the trading post miles away. Her husband had been gone for almost a year now, buried under the cottonwood near the ridge. She still caught herself listening for his boots at the door, still set out 2 plates some nights before remembering she was alone. Life on the frontier taught people to keep moving, but grief had a way of freezing time just as surely as the winter wind. When she heard the knock, her first instinct was fear. Out here, a knock could mean anything, a traveler, a thief, or something worse. She reached for the old rifle resting by the hearth, her heart drumming against her ribs. The knock came again, slow and steady, like a man with nothing to hide. She opened the door a few inches and saw him, tall, wrapped in a fur coat, his hair long and dark, his face weathered by cold and distance. His eyes caught the flicker of firelight, steady and searching. Snow clung to his shoulders and melted into drops that ran down his coat. He didn't speak at first, only lifted a bundle from his saddlebag and held it up, a pile of fine furs, clean and valuable. "I came to trade," he said in a low voice. 10 furs for a night under your roof." The words sounded strange, not just for what they meant, but for how he said them. A night under her roof could mean warmth, shelter, food, or something more. She studied him for a long moment. He looked like a man who'd been through too many winters alone, yet his tone wasn't bold, not the way most drifters spoke. There was a quiet respect in his eyes that made her pause. 10 furs is a heavy price for one night, she replied, her voice careful. "You could buy a month's stay at the post for half that." He nodded once, then stepped closer, the snow crunching beneath his boots. "I'm not welcome at the post." "Not anymore." Something about his tone told her not to ask why. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the door, but the wind cut sharp against her face, and she could see how his horse trembled from exhaustion. Against her better judgment, she opened the door wide. "You can stay," she said softly, "but only for the night." He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, and the warmth of the fire filled the space between them. He placed the furs on the table, thick pelts of fox and beaver, enough to feed a family through the season. She didn't want to take them, but he insisted, saying he had no use for trade goods where he was going. The widow poured him coffee, her hands trembling just slightly. He drank it slowly, eyes drifting around the cabin, the simple wooden walls, the single chair, the empty cradle in the corner covered by a worn quilt. She noticed his gaze linger there a moment longer than she liked. "You're alone here," he said quietly. She nodded. "Been that way a while." He didn't ask what happened. Maybe he already knew. Out on the frontier, everyone carried stories written in their eyes, and few had the courage to speak them aloud. As the fire burned low, he took off his coat, revealing a body marked by scars and cold. He moved with the quiet strength of a man used to surviving by instinct alone. There was something raw in the way he looked at the flames, something that made her heart twist, not out of fear, but out of recognition. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel empty. The silence between them wasn't hollow but alive, filled with things neither dared to say. She found herself studying the stranger's hands, the way they rested on the table, rough but gentle, as though they'd once known kindness. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the cry of a wolf through the valley. He looked toward the sound and said almost to himself, "They always hunt in pairs. One draws your eyes while the other comes from behind." The widow shivered, not from the cold but from the weight in his voice. She wondered what kind of man spoke that way, someone who'd been hunted, or someone who'd done the hunting. He caught her stare and smiled faintly. "Don't worry. I won't bring trouble to your door," but trouble had a way of finding men like him. She could feel it in the air, the same way she could feel a storm before it broke. Later that night, while the wind howled outside, she found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the fire, watching his shadow move against the wall as he checked his gear. There was a rifle by his bedroll, a knife by his boot, and a quiet alertness in his every movement. He wasn't resting. He was waiting. She finally asked, "What are you running from?" He looked up, his eyes catching the firelight again. "Not running," he said. "Just waiting for the snow to cover the tracks." Something inside her shifted. She had spent months trying to bury her grief under chores and silence, but his words stirred something she thought she'd lost, a memory of what it meant to feel alive. When dawn came, the storm had passed, leaving the valley still and white. The stranger saddled his horse, ready to leave. She stepped out to hand him the furs he'd offered, but he only shook his head. "I said they were for a night," he reminded her. "You paid too much," she said softly. He paused, his breath fogging in the cold. "Then keep them. You'll need them more than I do." Before she could speak, he turned his horse toward the ridge. The rising sun painted the snow in shades of gold and rose, and for a moment, he looked almost unreal against it, a figure caught between the past and the wild. As he rode away, she realized she didn't even know his name, but something in her heart told her this wasn't the last she'd see of him. Hours later, while she was gathering wood near the creek, she found footprints, fresh, deep, and leading toward her cabin from the ridge. Not his, but several others. She froze, her breath quickening. Whoever they were, they had come after him, and they were close. The sound of distant hooves echoed through the trees. She turned toward the ridge, her eyes narrowing against the glare of the snow, and for the first time in months, she felt fear mixed with something else. Purpose. The stranger had offered 10 furs for a night, but she had given him warmth, shelter, and something far greater than trade could measure. Now, as the riders approached, she knew she was part of his story, whether she wanted to be or not. And somewhere beyond the white horizon, he was waiting for the storm he knew would follow. The widow stood still among the snow-covered trees, her breath catching in the cold air. The trail of footprints near the creek was not his. These were heavier, broader, spaced wider apart. There were at least 3 sets, maybe more. They moved with purpose, cutting through the valley from the north ridge where the wind always carried the scent of danger. She crouched down, brushing her gloved hand across one of the prints. The snow was fresh, only an hour old. Whoever they were closing in fast. She straightened, her heart pounding as she looked toward the ridge. The stranger had disappeared over that rise at dawn, riding into the open plains beyond. Now, with the sound of hooves echoing faintly through the trees, she knew he wasn't far from trouble. It wasn't her fight, she told herself. He was just a traveler passing through, a man who had offered furs for shelter and nothing more. But something deep inside her refused to let it go. Maybe it was the look in his eyes last night, the look of a man who carried his burdens alone because no one ever offered to help. She hurried back to the cabin, her boots breaking through the snow. Inside, she tossed more wood on the fire, trying to steady her thoughts. The warmth filled the room, but it couldn't chase away the unease creeping through her chest. She reached for her husband's rifle, the one she hadn't touched since he'd passed. The metal was cold, the wood worn smooth by his hands. She checked the chamber. It still held 2 cartridges. She didn't know if she'd ever have the courage to fire it, but holding it brought a strange comfort. The valley had always been quiet since the war ended, but quiet could turn dangerous when strangers came through. The nearest town was days away, and the law rarely came this far. Out here, justice was something people made for themselves. She'd seen what happened to those who didn't. By midday, the storm clouds began to gather again. She could feel the air tighten, heavy with snow and something else she couldn't name. The wind carried faint voices, men shouting orders, horses snorting through the cold. She stepped to the window and caught sight of dark figures moving along the far edge of the valley. 4 riders, wrapped in long coats, rifles strapped across their saddles. They weren't traders or trappers. Their movements were too precise, too sure. Her pulse quickened as she watched them fan out, one heading toward the ridge, another toward the creek. They were hunting. She didn't need to ask who. That evening, as the wind howled through the trees, the widow sat by the fire with the rifle across her knees. Every creak of the cabin made her flinch. She tried to tell herself she owed the stranger nothing, but her conscience didn't agree. The world had taken enough from her already, her husband, her peace, her sense of belonging. Letting another man fall to the same fate felt like surrendering what little humanity she had left. She remembered her husband's last words before he'd gone off to the mines that final winter. A person's worth ain't in what they keep. It's in what they give when it costs them the most. She hadn't understood it then, but now, with danger breathing down the valley, those words burned in her memory like the fire on the hearth. By nightfall, The storm returned. The snow came heavy and silent, cloaking the land in white. She pulled on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and stepped outside. The cold bit at her skin, but she didn't hesitate. She followed the tracks toward the ridge, the rifle slung over her shoulder. The forest whispered around her, branches bending under the weight of snow. After what felt like hours, she saw a dim glow ahead. A campfire, flickering weakly against the wind. She crouched behind a tree and peered through the branches. The stranger sat by the fire, his horse tied nearby, steam rising from its nostrils. He looked calm, almost too calm, as if he already knew he wasn't alone. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning his head. His voice carried through the still air, low and certain. She stepped out from the shadows, snow crunching underfoot. "Neither should you," she said. "They're coming for you." He looked up then, eyes catching the firelight. "I know. Who are they?" she asked. "Men I used to ride with," he said simply. "Before I learned some things are worth more than a share of blood money." The widow's grip on the rifle tightened. "So they're bounty men?" "Worse," he replied, standing. "They hunt for pride, not pay." She swallowed hard. The wind picked up, scattering sparks from the fire. "You could have kept riding. Why stop here?" He studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because I promised myself I'd stop running when I found a place worth stopping for." The words hung between them, heavy and uncertain. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the distant echo of horses cut through the air. The riders were closer now. He doused the fire with a sweep of snow and turned toward her. "You should go," he said. "They won't spare you if they find you with me." She shook her head. "If they're coming this way, they'll find my cabin too." He paused, then gave a small nod. "Then we stand together." They moved quickly through the snow, retracing her path toward the cabin. The storm thickened, the wind biting hard against their faces. The night swallowed every sound except their boots crunching in rhythm. When they reached the creek, he stopped and knelt, brushing away snow from the ground. Beneath it, a thin layer of ice gleamed. "They'll cross here," he said. "It's the shallowest point." "What will you do?" she asked. He glanced at her rifle. "You still know how to use that?" "I used to," she replied quietly. He smiled faintly. "Then you remember more than most." Back at the cabin, they set what little defense they could. A lantern by the window, the door barred with a wooden beam, the rifle loaded and ready. The widow tried to keep her hands steady as she worked, but fear made her movements clumsy. The stranger moved with quiet purpose, checking the window, then his rifle, his every motion deliberate. "Why did they turn on you?" she finally asked. He hesitated, then spoke. "Because I walked away. We took from people who had nothing left to give. One night I couldn't stomach it anymore. They called it betrayal." The firelight flickered across his face, revealing lines of pain and weariness that ran deeper than scars. She saw then that he wasn't just a wanderer. He was a man carrying ghosts. "They won't stop until they find me," he said. "But I won't let them touch this place." Her heart tightened at his words. She didn't know why it mattered so much, but it did. Maybe because no one had stood for her since her husband's death. Maybe because for the first time in a long time someone cared enough to fight. The wind howled louder, shaking the cabin walls. Then came the faint sound of horses again, closer, circling. She and the stranger exchanged a look, both understanding what it meant. "Stay by the window," he said quietly. "If they try the door, you fire." She nodded, her hands gripping the rifle, pulse thundering in her ears. The snow outside glowed faintly under the moonlight. Shadows moved among the trees, slow and cautious. One of the riders called out, his voice rough with cold. "We know you're in there. Make it easy and come out." The stranger stepped to the door but didn't open it. "You had your chance," he called back. The reply came in the form of a gunshot, sharp and cruel against the night. The bullet tore through the edge of the door, splintering the wood. The widow flinched, heart racing. The stranger motioned her down, eyes hard with focus. The next few minutes passed like a blur, shadows darting, hooves stamping, gunfire echoing through the valley. The widow fired once through the window, the sound ringing in her ears. The stranger moved like the storm itself, silent, swift, precise. Then came silence, heavy and waiting. She dared to look outside. The snow was red in places. The riders had scattered, some retreating into the trees. The stranger stood near the fence, rifle raised, his breath visible in the freezing air. When he came back inside, his coat was torn, and a streak of blood marked his sleeve. She rushed forward, but he waved her off. "It's nothing," he said, though his voice was rough. "You can't fight them alone," she said. "They'll come back. I'm counting on it, he replied. Because next time I'll be ready. He sank into the chair by the fire, exhaustion settling over him. The widow knelt beside him, pressing a cloth against his wound. He didn't pull away. For a long time neither spoke. The wind outside had calmed, but the air inside the cabin was thick with unspoken words. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was low. You said you stopped running when you found a place worth it. Is this that place? He looked at her, eyes dark and steady. Ask me when the snow melts. Outside, the storm moved on, leaving the valley quiet once more. But inside that cabin, two lives, one broken by loss, the other by guilt, had begun to cross paths neither could yet understand. And far beyond the ridge, in the shadows of the forest, the rest of the riders were regrouping, their rage burning hotter than the cold that surrounded them. The morning after the fight, the valley looked harmless again, but the widow felt the danger in every quiet patch of snow. She swept the torn wood from the floor and mended the door with a plank her husband had cut months before he died. The stranger helped without speaking. He worked like a man who measured time by chores, not hours. When they finished, he stood at the window and watched the ridge while steam rose from the kettle. She poured him coffee and set bread by the coals to warm. It felt almost like a home morning, the kind people used to have before the world got hard. Yet under it all ran a current she could not ignore. The riders would return. People like that never lost interest until something broke. He asked to look in the small barn behind the cabin. She followed him out, boots sinking into clean snow beneath the cottonwood. The old stall held a half sack of oats and a broken sled. He ran a hand along the sled runner and nodded. The widow realized he was mapping escape without saying so. A line of trap sets hung from a peg, her husband's winter work. When the stranger saw the tags burned into the wood, he paused and touched one with his thumb. She saw respect there that softened her guard. Only folks who had lived on lean seasons understood what it meant to fix and mend and stretch the last bit of rope until spring. They took turns keeping watch. In the quiet hours, she found herself thinking of the last autumn, when the valley had smelled of sage and wood smoke. She had sold quilts at the trading post and returned with flour and coffee and a tin of pepper. Her husband had promised it would be the last season in the mines, that he would trap with her instead and stay near the cabin. Snow had fallen early. He never made it home. The men who brought his body said the ledge had given way. She had not asked if anyone pushed it. That kind of question could hollow a person clean through. By midday, the stranger spread a rough map on the table, scratched into rawhide with charcoal. The creek ran like a dark vein across it. He marked 2 crossings, 3 sheltered bends, and a draw beneath the ridge where riders could pass unseen. He spoke softly, careful and plain. There were 4 riders last night, maybe 5 in all. One carried a long rifle and held back, patient. Another spoke like a man who wanted blood quick. The worst kind of danger, he said, was not the loud man at the door. It was the quiet one who did not need to shout. In the late afternoon, the widow hitched her mare to the broken sled with rope and wire while the stranger repaired the front runner. They worked shoulder to shoulder. Snow dust blew around them like sifted flour. She noticed he moved more slowly than morning and saw the wound at his sleeve seeping again. When she reached to help, he shook his head. Not from pride, but from worry she might be seen leaning close. People in the valley, he said, believed stories faster than they believed truth. She told him the only eyes here were hers and the crow's. A shadow moved along the far fence. She raised the rifle and aimed steady. It was a boy. He stood with his hands up, hat crushed against his chest, breath fogging. The stranger stepped forward and motioned the boy in. He looked no more than 15. His coat was too big and his boots too thin for the weather. He said he came from the old mission road and had seen riders pass at dawn. He had followed the back trail because one of the riders was his older brother. The boy's voice cracked when he spoke that last part, like a branch under snow. He said his brother used to ride straight, then fell in with bad company after the war. Now the men he ran with took what they wanted and bragged at the post. The boy had come to warn them that the riders meant to burn the cabin that night to smoke the stranger out. He would not say his brother's name. The widow gave the boy stew and listened. She watched the stranger's face as the boy talked. Something in him changed when he heard of a brother tied to that crew. He asked the boy quiet questions about an old scar, a habit with a knife, a way of laughing at the wrong time. The boy nodded to each one. The stranger stared at the table, and the widow saw the truth settle over him like the weight of a wet blanket. He knew the brother, not by name but by the damage left behind. The stranger said nothing more. The boy finished his stew, pulled on his thin coat and asked to sit in the barn until night. He said he would not be seen at the window for fear his brother might spot him. The widow laid a quilt in the hay and told him to rest. As evening dimmed, the stranger told her a story he had avoided telling. The crew he used to ride with had a rule: never return to a place you take from. That rule had been broken one winter at a ranch north of the Platte. The men had returned because the first haul felt easy. The second time brought guns. A woman stood in a doorway with a baby on her hip. The quiet man of the crew shot the lantern to scare them and hit the rafters instead. The roof caught. After that night, the stranger said he could not keep riding with them. He left at dawn and took nothing. The quiet man swore to find him and settle the account. The widow asked who the quiet man was. The stranger answered with a look toward the ridge. They doused the hearth to a low glow and set a lantern near the window as a decoy. The stranger took position by the rear wall, where boards overlapped and gave a narrow view of the yard. The widow crouched behind the table with the rifle across her knees. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. The boy slept in the barn, a small rise of quilt among the stalls. The storm paused and the stillness pressed in until even breath sounded loud. A match flared outside, then winked out. A second one scratched and failed. The third took. A narrow flame crawled along the edge of straw piled by the shed. The widow's stomach flipped. The stranger slipped out the back like smoke, circling wide. She watched a figure bend to shield the small fire from wind. The stranger moved to strike, then stopped. Another shadow stood beyond the first, rifle ready. The first man was bait. The stranger changed his angle and vanished into the dark. The widow rose to grab the water bucket, but a knock came at the front door. Not a heavy knock, not a demand. A soft tap a person might use to avoid waking a child. The widow froze. The knock came again, 2 beats, a pause, a third. She remembered how the stranger had knocked that first night. Not the same rhythm, different. She kept still. The tap came a 4th time, along with a voice low enough to hide its owner. It asked for mercy in the name of the flag and the Almighty. The words were chosen for a woman's ear. She did not move. Hooves clattered. The fire on the straw sputtered, then brightened. The stranger suddenly burst from the shadow, seized the small flame with a wet burlap and smashed it out. A rifle fired from the trees and hit the post where his head had been. He rolled, fired once into the dark, then twice more at a horse to scatter the line. Men shouted. The boy in the barn woke with a gasp. The widow ran for the bucket anyway and doused the stray sparks near the shed. Smoke curled thin and acrid. The night erupted, then stilled again. The riders did not press for a full assault. They pulled back to the timber and waited. The widow felt it like a hand on the back of her neck. This was not a rush. This was a measured trial to learn how she and the stranger moved. The quiet one was counting. He would come when they were tired. They waited through the hours that bend a person. The stranger's eyes stayed fixed on the line of timber. He talked in a low tone to keep the widow's breath steady. He told her how snow held sound and how a creek will whisper different when a person stands in it. He gave her the small things a person can hold in the dark. She gave him her husband's lucky coin, a tarnished silver piece kept in a jar by the bed. Keep it, she said. She did not know why she offered it, only that some part of her wanted this man to have something of the cabin to carry. He turned it in his fingers, then tucked it in his coat with a nod. Near dawn, the boy crept from the barn and whispered that he could draw his brother out. He said there was a call they used as children, a whistle like a meadowlark. If he made it by the creek, his brother would answer without thinking. The stranger stared at the snow, then at the boy's worn boots. He told the boy no. The boy pleaded. The widow felt the ache in it. She said the boy was right about blood. The stranger held his breath a long moment and weighed risk against hope. He told the boy to make the whistle only once, then drop flat and cover his head. He would watch the timber for any movement. The widow would hold the rifle on the door. The boy went out, a small figure against the gray morning. He moved to the creek's bend and stood where the ice made a thin song. He whistled. The sound was so clean it lifted the hairs on the widow's arms. A heartbeat passed, then another. Far off in the trees an answering call rose, quick and soft, the habit of a boy not yet taught to guard his heart. 2 shapes broke from cover and ran low toward the sound. The stranger fired to the side of the first one to drive him right. The second dove behind a stump. A third shape the widow had not seen before, slipped from a different angle. The quiet one. The quiet one did not run toward the creek. He came toward the cabin straight and careful, knowing the boy had pulled eyes away. He moved like a man who trusted only his own plan. The stranger tracked him, but the quiet one had the door and wall between them. The widow saw the shape rise at the corner. She did not breathe. The door latch trembled. The coin in the stranger's pocket caught the faint light as he stepped left to cover the window. The latch lifted. The door opened the width of a hand. Fingers slid along the beam. The widow raised the rifle and drew a bead on the dark. She could see the quiet one's sleeve now, a weave finer than a cowhand's, the sort a man wears when he wants to look like someone else. She felt her finger tighten. For an instant she saw another scene the same size in her mind. A doorway, a lantern shot, a roof taking fire, a woman holding a child. She dropped the barrel a hair, just enough to mark without killing, and fired. Wood burst. The quiet one jerked back with a grunt and hissed for the others. He had not expected the woman to shoot. The yard filled with motion. The boy scrambled behind the sled. The stranger sprinted wide to cut off a flanking move. The quiet one called orders with a voice that reminded the widow of a saw working through green wood. He did not waste sound. He placed men like pieces across a winter board and pressed when he felt weakness. The widow reloaded with shaking hands and thought of the cottonwood where her husband lay. She thought of the empty cradle and the long nights when wind and grief were the only company. She set her jaw. This was her ground. The fight surged and ebbed. No side claimed it. A horse screamed and tore loose. A man swore as cold water took his boot at the creek. The boy crawled to the barn and came back with a coil of rope, a strange determined light in his eyes. He had a plan of his own, something from farm days when he and his brother played at war with sacks and sticks. He whispered it to the widow and pointed at the sled and the low hill by the fence. She nodded. The stranger frowned at the risk, then nodded too. Sometimes a small idea works when a big one fails. They set the rope and dragged the sled half up the hill, anchoring it with a stake and a knot. When a rider charged for the door in a burst of boldness, the widow cut the knot with a hatchet and the sled slid down, swift and heavy, knocking horse and man into the drift by the porch. The rider cursed, flailed, and fired wild. The quiet one shouted for retreat to the timber. Snow swallowed their shapes again. Silence fell, not clean but charged. The widow stood in the doorway, chest heaving, hair stuck to her cheeks with sweat and melted snow. The stranger leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a heartbeat, then opened them like a man who will not let himself fall. The boy clutched the rope and stared at the ground where the sled had struck. None of them spoke. The morning had broken, and with it came the knowledge that the quiet one would change tactics. From the trees a single shot rang out, not aimed at them, but high, a signal. It rolled along the ridge and came back thin. Moments later, the far slope answered with another shot, then a third from the west, then a fourth from the north road. The widow's stomach went hollow. The quiet one had called for more men. The valley began to close like a fist. The stranger lifted the coin from his pocket and turned it once, slow. He looked at the widow and then at the boy in the doorway. He said they had two choices and neither was safe. The boy whispered that his brother would follow his whistle anywhere if he heard it again. The widow said the sled could carry two if the ice held at the upper crossing, where the creek ran faster and shallow. The stranger shook his head at both, then pointed toward the cottonwood and the slope beyond it, where old snow hit a rockfall in a narrow cut. There was a third way, he said, but it required courage and luck in the same breath. Before he could explain, the quiet one stepped out from the trees alone, hat in hand, hands visible, the mark on his sleeve dark where her shot had cut him. He walked to the edge of the yard and stopped where the prints from the night still showed in the crust. He called the stranger's name at last, a name the widow had not heard. He said he had come to make a trade. 10 furs for a single night, he said with a thin smile, and the valley seemed to lean in to hear what price would be asked this time. The quiet one stood in the snow, hat in hand, his voice cutting through the still air like a blade. The words he spoke were cold, almost mocking. 10 furs for a single night, he repeated, his eyes locked on the stranger. The echo of that old offer sent a chill through the widow's chest. It wasn't just an insult. It was a reminder of the debt between them, one the quiet one had no intention of forgiving. The stranger didn't answer right away. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the faint smell of burned powder from the night before. "You came a long way to talk about trade," he said evenly. The quiet one smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Trade's all this ever was. You took what wasn't yours to take. You walked away when the rest of us stayed to finish the job. That makes you a thief in my book." The widow stood by the door, rifle in hand, her heart pounding. She could see the quiet one's breath rising like smoke, see the way his fingers rested near his holster, even as he pretended to speak calmly. The stranger didn't move. For a moment it felt as though the whole valley had stopped breathing. Then the quiet one's tone changed. "But I'm a fair man," he said. "Give yourself up and I'll spare the woman. I've got no quarrel with her." The stranger's eyes hardened. "You don't make promises like that," he said. "Not when you've burned homes before." The widow could see it now. the truth she'd been circling since the night he arrived. This wasn't just about survival. The Quiet One wasn't chasing bounty or gold. He was chasing revenge. The Quiet One's smile faded. You think hiding behind her walls makes you a better man? I think walking away makes me one, the stranger said quietly. The silence after that was heavy, almost unbearable. Then the Quiet One turned and walked back toward the trees, calling over his shoulder. You've got till sundown. When the light dies, so do you. He disappeared into the timber, leaving behind a trail of tension thick enough to choke on. The stranger came back inside, his face grim. The boy was standing near the window, clutching the rope he'd used for the sled trap. He's calling more men, the boy said. I know, the stranger replied. He's setting a circle. When night falls, we'll be surrounded. The widow lowered her rifle, trying to steady her breathing. We can't stay here. They'll burn the place. I won't let that happen, the stranger said. There's a cut beyond the cottonwood, a narrow pass through the rock. If we make it before night, we can lose them in the ridge. The boy looked up sharply. They'll see the tracks. Not if the storm holds, the stranger said. Snow's coming again. Harder this time. The widow wanted to believe him, but the thought of leaving her home, the only thing she had left of her husband, made her chest ache. She looked around at the small cabin, the worn chair by the hearth, the quilt folded on the cradle, the dented tin cup on the table. Every corner held a memory. If we run, she said softly, what happens when they find this place empty? The stranger met her gaze. They'll burn it either way. You can rebuild a cabin. You can't rebuild your life once they take it. He was right, and she knew it. But the truth still stung. They worked quickly, gathering what they could carry: flour, salt, a small tin of matches, the rifle, and the boy's rope. The stranger wrapped his wound with cloth torn from a flour sack, though it was clear the pain hadn't left him. Every movement cost him more than he let on. By the time they were ready, the snow had begun to fall again, thick and steady. The sky had turned the color of iron, and the wind hummed through the valley like a warning. They left through the back, leading the horses quietly down the slope. The boy carried the sled rope over his shoulder, glancing back toward the ridge where dark shapes were already beginning to appear. The widow took one last look at her home. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney, curling upward into the gray sky. She whispered a silent goodbye and turned away. They followed the creek north, moving fast and low through the trees. The snow muffled their steps, but every sound, the crack of a branch, the whinny of a horse, made the widow's heart jump. The stranger led them with calm precision, scanning the tree line, always aware of what lay behind them. After an hour, they reached the cottonwood grove. The storm was building fast now, snow swirling so thick it blurred the ridges ahead. The stranger stopped to check the ground. We'll rest here for a moment, he said. The widow leaned against the tree, her legs trembling from the cold and fear. The boy crouched by a log, tying a loop in his rope. If they come through the lower trail, he said quietly, we could drop a tree across it. The stranger nodded. Good thinking, but it won't stop them for long. He looked at the widow. We'll have to keep moving before they close in. Just then, a rifle cracked in the distance. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder. Another shot followed, closer. They're tracking us, the stranger said, his voice low. They split the group. The widow's pulse raced. She could see movement through the falling snow, dark figures slipping between trees, spreading out. The stranger pulled the boy close. You know this valley better than they do. Can you find the old washout near the ridge? The boy nodded quickly. Yes. There's a narrow turn there, too tight for horses. Good. Lead the widow there. Stay low and don't look back. The widow grabbed his arm. What are you doing? He met her eyes. Buying time. You'll be killed, she said, her voice shaking. Maybe, he said, but not before I make them think twice about following you. The wind whipped around them, snow lashing their faces. He pressed the silver coin she'd given him back into her palm. Keep this, he said, for luck. Before she could answer, he turned and disappeared into the storm, rifle in hand. The widow and the boy ran, hearts pounding, the wind howling through the trees. The snow grew heavier, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they made them. Behind them, gunfire echoed, sharp, angry bursts swallowed by the wind. They reached the washout, a steep gully choked with rocks and dead branches. The boy pointed to a narrow path winding upward through the ridge. This way. They scrambled up, slipping on the icy slope. The widow's breath came in ragged gasps, her hands raw from the cold. At the top, they found a small hollow under a jut of stone, a place barely big enough to hide them both. She crouched there, pulling the boy close, listening. The storm screamed through the valley, drowning out almost everything. Then she heard it, a single shot, distant but clear. Then silence. Her heart twisted. She wanted to believe he'd escaped, but the quiet pressed too long. The boy looked at her, wide-eyed. "Do you think he's alive?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Minutes stretched like hours. The wind eased, and through the curtain of snow, she saw movement on the lower trail, shapes moving in formation. The riders, 5, maybe 6 now. They were fanning out, their dark coats ghostly against the white. The quiet one was among them, his arm bandaged, his posture proud and sure. He dismounted near the cottonwood and studied the ground. Even from a distance, she could sense his cold patience. He knew the storm would cover their trail soon. He was enjoying the chase. The boy whispered, "If they follow the creek, they'll reach the ridge in minutes." The widow clenched the coin in her fist, the metal burning cold against her skin. Every part of her wanted to run, but some instinct deeper than fear kept her still. Down below, a flicker of movement caught her eye. The stranger. He was alive. He moved like a ghost through the trees, keeping low, circling behind the riders. His rifle was steady despite the wound. The widow's breath caught in her throat as she watched him position himself along the ridgeline. The quiet one raised his hand, signaling his men forward. Just as they began to move, the stranger fired. One rider fell from his horse. Chaos erupted. The others scattered, shouting into the storm. The quiet one ducked behind a stump and fired back. The sound tore through the valley like the sky cracking open. The boy gripped her arm. "We have to help him." She looked down at the fight unfolding below, the flash of gunfire, the smoke rising through the snow, the stranger moving with desperate precision. And then she saw something that froze her blood. 2 riders had broken off, circling wide, straight toward the ridge where she and the boy were hiding. "Get down," she whispered. They crouched lower, hearts hammering, the snow stinging their faces. The riders drew closer, their boots creaking, their horses' breaths visible in the cold air. One of them carried a torch, its light flickering against the white. The widow reached for the rifle. Her hands trembled, but she steadied her aim. The boy looked at her, his eyes full of fear and trust. Below, the stranger was still fighting, pinned behind the rocks. The quiet one's voice rose above the storm, calm and cruel. "You can't save them both," he shouted. "Pick your death, old friend." The widow's finger tightened on the trigger. She could see the riders' silhouettes now, so close she could make out their faces under the torchlight. Her breath fogged the barrel of the rifle. Somewhere in the valley, the quiet one fired again, and the echo of that shot rolled through the trees like thunder, and in that heartbeat before the world erupted again, she knew the next move would decide everything, who lived, who died, and whether the storm swallowed them all before dawn. The widow held her breath, her fingers steady on the trigger as the riders drew closer through the swirling snow. The one with the torch turned his head toward the ridge, the flame lighting half his face. The boy's hand gripped her sleeve tightly. She could hear the horses breathing, the crunch of hooves on frozen ground, and the faint echo of gunfire still drifting from below. Somewhere out there, the stranger was fighting for their lives. When the rider stepped closer, the widow fired. The shot cracked through the air, sharp and final. The man fell backward, the torch tumbling from his hand into the snow. The other rider shouted and wheeled his horse, trying to see where the shot came from, but the storm swallowed all sound and sight. Before he could aim, the boy hurled the sled rope he'd been holding, catching the rider's arm and jerking him off balance. His horse reared and bolted, vanishing into the white. The widow and the boy stayed still, hearts racing. Then came another gunshot, closer, heavier. The widow looked toward the valley below and saw the quiet one fall to one knee behind the stump. The stranger had hit him. He was still alive, but his aim had found its mark. The remaining riders scattered, their courage broken by the storm and by the man who refused to fall. It ended almost as suddenly as it had begun. The valley grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that only comes after chaos. The snow kept falling, soft and endless, covering the traces of what had happened. When it was finally over, the widow and the boy climbed down from the ridge. Their legs trembled from exhaustion and cold. Smoke drifted faintly where a rifle had fired too close to the dry brush. The boy moved ahead, calling softly, "Sir, are you there?" They found him kneeling near the creek, the rifle still in his hand. The quiet one lay a few paces away, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. The stranger looked up as they approached, his face pale and tired. "It's done," he said quietly. The widow dropped to her knees beside him. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for his shoulder. He shook his head. "It's not bad." The boy knelt beside the quiet one, who groaned and tried to lift his head. His eyes opened, full of the same cold fire that had driven him all this way. "You should have finished it," he hissed. The stranger stood steady despite the pain. "No," he said. "I've done enough killing." The quiet one let out a dry laugh. "You think this changes anything?" "It changes me," the stranger said simply. He turned to the boy and nodded toward the ridge. "Go fetch his horse. He won't last long without it." The boy hesitated. "You're letting him go?" The stranger's voice was firm. "I'm ending this, not continuing it." The quiet one's glare flickered with something almost like shame. The boy did as he was told, leading one of the stray horses from the edge of the grove. The quiet one climbed into the saddle with help, grimacing as he did. For a long moment he stared down at the stranger. "You'll never belong anywhere," he said. "Maybe," the stranger replied, "but I'll still live with myself." The quiet one turned his horse toward the ridge and rode into the storm, swallowed by the snow until he was gone. When the silence returned, the widow finally let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands trembled as she brushed the snow from her skirt. The stranger leaned against a tree, eyes closed, his strength fading fast. "Come on," she said softly. "We need to get you warm." They made their way back to the cabin in silence, the boy following with the horses. The snow covered the blood and footprints as if the valley itself wanted to forget. By the time they reached the door, the storm had quieted, leaving only a soft gray sky and the faint glow of dawn. Inside, the widow lit the fire and helped him to the chair by the hearth. He sat still, eyes following the dancing flames. The boy brought in more wood, working quickly, his young face set with a kind of quiet purpose. The widow wrapped the stranger's arm with clean cloth and poured him a cup of coffee, though most of it sloshed onto the floor from her shaking hands. "You could have left me," he said after a long pause. "I couldn't," she replied simply. "You gave me reason to stand again. I wasn't about to lose that." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from deep exhaustion rather than joy. "You've got more courage than most men I've known." The firelight flickered across his face, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she saw peace there, tired, worn peace, but real. The boy sat near the door, watching the snow through the cracks. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked quietly. The stranger shook his head. "No, not after this." The quiet one was their spine. "Without him, they'll scatter." The widow looked at the boy. "And what about you? Do you have anywhere to go?" He hesitated, glancing down. "Not anymore," he said softly. She nodded. "Then you'll stay here until spring. There's work enough for 3 and it's safer together." The boy's eyes brightened, though he said nothing. For the next few days, they worked side by side to rebuild what the storm and the gunfire had taken. The barn roof was patched, the fence repaired, and the horses fed. The widow found herself speaking more than she had in months. Small things at first, then memories, then laughter that surprised her when it came. The stranger helped quietly, saying little, but his presence filled the cabin with something warm she hadn't felt since before her husband's death. Sometimes she caught him standing by the creek at dusk, looking toward the ridge where the quiet one had vanished. He would touch the scar on his arm and then the silver coin she'd given him, now tied to a strip of leather around his neck. She never asked what he was thinking, and he never offered to tell. Some things on the frontier didn't need to be spoken to be understood. When spring finally came, the snow melted into rushing streams that sang through the valley. The air smelled of pine and thawed earth. The stranger saddled his horse one morning, as the widow hung fresh linens outside to dry. The boy stood nearby, his face shadowed with the knowledge of what was coming. "You're leaving," the widow said quietly, not turning from the wash line. He nodded. "The world's wide. Too many ghosts for me to settle anywhere too long." She looked at him then, her eyes steady. "You don't owe me anything, but if you ever need a place to rest, you'll find one here." He smiled, faint but genuine. "You've given me more than I can repay." He reached into his coat and placed something on the table, the silver coin. It kept me alive. It should stay where it belongs, she shook her head. Keep it. You earned it. He looked at it for a moment, then pressed it into her hand anyway. Then call it a promise, he said. That I'll find my way back one day. The widow didn't answer. She just watched as he mounted his horse, the boy holding the reins steady. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long rays across the valley, lighting the creek, the trees, and the cabin that had seen both loss and rebirth. He turned once at the ridge and lifted his hand in farewell. The widow stood by the fence, her hair caught by the wind, the coin warm in her palm. She didn't cry. She only whispered, "Ride safe." When he disappeared beyond the cottonwood, the valley felt different. Not empty, but alive again. The boy came to stand beside her, his eyes on the horizon. "Do you think he'll come back?" She smiled faintly. "A man like that never really leaves. The land keeps their stories." The days passed and life settled into rhythm again. The widow planted her small garden, fixed the shutters, and watched the green return to the hills. Sometimes at night, when the fire burned low and the world outside was still, she would hear the faint echo of hoofbeats carried on the wind. Whether they were real or just memory, she didn't know. But she'd learned something the winter the stranger came. Strength wasn't in fighting alone. It was in opening the door when someone needed shelter, in giving more than you were asked to give. Even when the world had taken too much already, the valley would remember the storm, the gunfire, and the man who had offered 10 furs for a single night but left her with far more, a chance to begin again. And though she never said it out loud, the widow knew deep down that not all stories of the frontier ended in loss. Some ended quietly, with the sound of snow melting, the whisper of water running free, and the hope that somewhere beyond the ridge, a man on horseback might be smiling toward home.